Microphone.
Kia ora, Mr Chairman. Tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you, Mr Chairman. It's an honour to take a brief call on this important bill, Reserves and Other Lands Disposal Bill. Second reading, Labor supports it. I've heard previous speakers, Mr Speaker, talk about it being a non-controversial bill. But looking at the process in which this bill's come to the House, it's anything but controversial. Mr Speaker, let's look at when the bill was first introduced. I note that it was introduced on the 15th of August 2008 by a fine colleague of ours, the Honourable David Parker, who I understood did an enormous amount of work to bring the bill to the House at that point of time. So I want to acknowledge Mr Parker for that. We had the first reading on the 10th of March in 2009. And Select Committee reported back on the 29th of September 2009. Mr Speaker, we are now in 2015. Previous speakers have made comment around the delay it's taken to get this piece of legislation in front of the House. I acknowledge the previous speaker, Mr Woodhouse, in saying there's competing interests when it comes to determining what's on the legislative program. But seriously, Mr Speaker, one of the risks that we run in delaying such important legislation, from my perspective, is things change in our communities. And I want to particularly draw the change of particularly iwi treaty settlements and ensuring that those parcels of land that are protected and reserved for Māori interests are protected through this piece of legislation, Mr Speaker. Like I said, the Honourable David Parker introduced the bill in 2008 to change the status of some selected parcels of land, and we continue to support it, though we have a few reservations which were rightfully raised at the Select Committee. The Select Committee reported back in September 2009, and this illustrates how desperate National is and how lacking they are in ideas. So lacking, I guess it probably pays mention to acknowledge the ministers in charge of this bill. Firstly, we had Mr Richard Worth, who was the minister in charge of the bill from that side of the House in the first reading, and since has ended his career in scandal. Then it was taken obviously over by Maurice Williamson, whose time as the minister ended again in scandal. So it's probably in the current minister's intention, the Honourable Louise Upton, to make sure we get this passage of legislation through as quickly as possible. Mr Speaker, I want to touch on two parts of the legislation that was raised at Select Committee, namely the number of submitters that presented, which overwhelmingly were not happy with the process. Labor joins in those submitters in saying that the process followed by the Auckland City Council probably could have been done a wee bit better. And just to highlight what I mean by that, Mr Speaker, the Auckland Council under the then Mayor John Banks thought that they could make some decisions and then bring to Parliament some legislation that retrospectively approves some of the decisions at the council level. And we all know, Mr Speaker, that legislation passed in retrospect throws its own risk and challenges. I earlier mentioned, Mr Speaker, around how things change in our environment, given that we are now 6 years on since the Select Committee reported back, and I did mention briefly about the importance of iwi treaty settlements and the controversial land. I want to draw, in my closing remarks, make the point that in the SOPs that were introduced in this bill, there were two particular parcels of land that I want to acknowledge: the Mahinapua Bay Reserve land and the espionage of Opua. And I wanted to make sure, Mr Speaker, that the government of the day can assure the House that no individual, particularly of Māori interests, will be disadvantaged by the passing of this legislation. Mr Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.